Now I'll show you how to finish edges using a household sewing machine, how to set up the stitch correctly, how to respond to various characteristics of the fabric, and how to set the thread tension. With a machine like this one, it's not so easy to get an attractive, professional-looking overlock seam, but with a few tips and tricks, you'll get some good results. The prerequisite is that you have already adjusted the tension for a straight line stitch with a perfectly normal stitch length. I showed you how in another video. Today's new settings will be based on those settings. Here, you can select how wide the top of the seam should be. This one is a medium width. This tells you how far the stitch will zigzag to the right and left. With this setting, it moves more, so it covers the entire available space. And with this setting, the puncture points would be very close together. These selections will vary from one machine to another, but the basic principle is always the same. We can select the width, and we can also select the length of the stitch. My recommendation is don't use the widest setting, because then, I'll try to show you what I mean, it pulls the fabric together and distorts it. Let me show you what I mean. Especially with very thin fabrics, you'll observe this problem, that it warps the fabric, and the seam is unattractive. I'm using a cotton poplin that is very thin but also quite stiff, and if I were to use this setting to sew a lining fabric, for example, or with silk, this undesirable effect would be even more pronounced. So I recommend using a medium setting like this one, for example, or perhaps even a bit more narrow. Of course, there is a danger when you're using a very narrow stitch that it's not sufficient to overlock the edges, and then the fabric can tear or unravel. But let's try it with this stitch. Here, with a little more distance, that is to say a longer stitch length, we'll leave the width at this medium setting. And already the results are better. The fabric is not being pulled together as much anymore. I'm using two different colored threads. The upper thread is purple, and the lower thread is red, so we can see how they're both behaving. And as you can see, there is a red dot visible from time to time. That means the lower thread is being pulled through. You can see it here. And on this side, if you look closely, the holding stitch is not exactly on the edge, but slightly offset to the inside. Now, once this has been pressed, it should be quite okay. I could improve things by loosening the tension of the upper thread a little bit. I would do that, for example, if I were finishing the edge of a lining fabric. Let me show you what I mean. A really thin fabric like this, whether it's a lining fabric or a fine silk, is pretty much the most difficult kind there is. With very thin fabrics, you'll have some of the rolling and distortion you see here. You can always loosen the upper thread tension a bit more. Now, of course, this is not the optimal thread tension, but at least the fabric is flat and not distorted. And here's another pro tip for you. I would rather have lower thread tension. This is too loose, but it still does the job. And later, this edge will be folded down and pressed, just like the edge on the other side of the seam. and then it feels better against your skin. It feels much nicer to have this flat and smooth than this, which is rough and thick. It's a thick, rough finish. So here's a general rule for the thread tension with a zigzag stitch. I'm using 2 different threads so you can see what's happening here. Here, the thread is too loose. Now I need to gradually tighten it little by little until the tension is right. So I'll give it another try. This is somewhat better. Here the holding stitches are a little bit more offset, and here they are just next to the edge. The previous setting was much too loose. The upper thread just started making thread spaghetti. We had nothing but loops. But I'm actually quite happy with this setting because the holding stitch, it's a little bit visible here, and it's right on the edge. And this side is also preferable. The holding stitch is in the right place, and when the seams have been pressed out, you won't feel them against your skin. They'll be hidden underneath. That's because I always finish the edges with the right side, the pretty side, the outside of the fabric, on top. That way, when you iron the finished seam apart, for example, you have that side of the fabric against your skin. When I'm finishing 2 edges together, it's even easier. The thicker the fabric, the easier this is. But we're now testing using just 1 layer of fabric, and I'll show you what it looks like when the tension is set even higher. What do we have here? The holding stitches of the lower thread, the red thread is the lower one, they're all peeking out here. And due to the higher tension, we're getting that rolling, puckering effect again. Now when I run my finger along it, I can feel the seam has a very rough finish, and that's exactly what we want to avoid. So I'll turn the setting down a little bit to loosen the tension again. And here comes another pro tip. Learn and remember your settings. Try it out with different color thread, and soon you'll notice, oh, for silk or lining material, I need a setting like this one here. In my case, it happens to be 2.8, but every machine is different. Make a note of your settings. And it's also easy to take a picture and make sure both the fabric and the settings are in the photo. For a medium thick fabric, I would do the process again with 2 colors for the upper and lower thread, photograph the fabric and the settings, and then once more for a very thick fabric. And then each time I need settings for a similar fabric, I can just check the pictures on my smartphone and decide which settings to use with each fabric, because you never change the tension of the lower thread. I always leave it alone. And really, it doesn't take much, often just a tiny adjustment to optimize the tension. So, to summarize, we don't use the machine's widest zigzag stitch, but one of the medium ones instead. How do you finish a corner? I'll show you here. Sew this far, lift the presser foot, It's that simple. I'll flatten this with my finger, and then subsequently I'll iron this corner flat, and that will make it pretty and attractive. And one more tip, when you really start sewing a lot, or you intend to start sewing a lot, your next investment should be an overlock machine. There are some that are not expensive. Many are in the medium price range, although of course upwards there are no limits. I probably wouldn't buy the cheapest one on the market, but one with a medium to good quality, and it will last you a lifetime. Your work will look much more professional if you use an overlock machine, of course. But to get started, a zigzag stitch will do the job nicely. So, have fun making attractive, finished edges.